Chapter 14, Blame Game. By the time he stomped into his classroom on Friday morning, Ted was so angry at Mrs. Mitchell he couldn't even look at her. And he was so fed up with the promises that he could hardly say the Pledge of Allegiance. And Ted was so mad at one particular Boy Scout that he was ready to punch himself in the nose. He wished he had just told Mrs. Mitchell a lie. He should have just said he went into the Andersons' driveway because he saw a crow feather lying on the ground. Something like that. Something simple. A simple lie. Over and done with. Then none of this would have had to happen. But it did happen. He broke his promise not to tell, and then Mrs. Mitchell broke her promise not to tell, and then April and her family got hauled away by Deputy Linwood. And what gave Mrs. Mitchell the right to be so nosy? When she'd asked him what he was doing at the Andersons' place, he should have just said, "None of your business, lady." That's what he should have said, just like that. After the pledge, Ted stalked over to his 6th grade command center, ducked under a desk, and sat in his swivel chair. He spun around to his writing desk, yanked out his top-secret red folder, and flipped to where he kept his file about Mrs. Mitchell. In large letters at the bottom of a page, he wrote, "She's a promise breaker, and she can't be trusted because she's a liar, and her nose is 20 miles long, and it flops around into everyone's business, and her breath smells almost all the time. She's the meanest, ugliest teacher in the whole world." When Ted made the 4th exclamation point, he pushed down so hard that he broke the lead of his pencil. "Ted?" He swiveled his chair, and there was the evil woman herself, with a big fake smile on her face. Mrs. Mitchell said, "Are you all right?" "Fine." Ted didn't look at her, and he didn't say the word. He spat at her. "Well, you don't look fine. You look upset." Ted swung his chair around so he faced the windows. He thought, "I should write my own mystery book. I'm going to call it The Case of the Teacher Who Was a Big, Fat Liar." Mrs. Mitchell had never seen Ted like this before. She thought it best to give him some time to cool down. Speaking to the back of his head, she said, "After I get the 4th graders working on their math, I'd like to have a talk with you, all right?" She couldn't tell if Ted nodded yes or shook his head no. But Mrs. Mitchell had to hurry over to the 4th grade corner so she could rescue Hannah, Lizzie, and Keith. Kevin was unbeatable at the word game Boggle, and he tried to force the others to play almost every morning, rattling the wooden letters inside the plastic game cube until the children had to put their hands over their ears. Ted glared out the window. "She wants to talk to me? Well, I don't want to talk to her. Maybe it's just going to be a bunch of excuses, or maybe lies. Yeah, she's probably going to lie, because once you've told one, it gets easier and easier." But it was hard for a boy like Ted to stay furious for long. And 10 minutes later, when Mrs. Mitchell asked him to follow her out of room 1, he went silently. He was going to listen to what she had to say. There was a pair of wooden chairs in the hallway, and when they were seated facing each other, Mrs. Mitchell tried to start on a positive note. "I was so glad we talked yesterday and that you were honest with me. It's important to always be honest." Ted thought, "Oh, this is great. She's talking about being honest after what she did? What does she think? That I'm that stupid? Unbelievable." Mrs. Mitchell saw that dark thought pass across Ted's face, but she kept talking, trying to win him over. "Well, I just want you to know that you can talk to me about anything that's bothering you, and it'll stay just between us." That was too much. Ted snorted and said, "You mean like the girl and her family at the Andersons' farm? You'll keep everything a secret like that?" Mrs. Mitchell said, "I'm glad you brought that up. We have to talk some more about them some more." Ted stood up fast, knocking the chair against the wall. "What's there to talk about? Just forget about it, okay?" Mrs. Mitchell said, "Well, it's not that simple, because of the children. Ted cut her off. "You should have thought about them before, because now it's too late." Mrs. Mitchell shook her head. "I didn't mean..." "Right," Ted said. "You didn't mean to mess everything up and ruin their lives, but you did. You did. And don't try to lie about it, because I know Deputy Linwood was out there. I saw the tire tracks this morning on the grass behind the house, and I found this." Ted held out the blue pencil he'd found. Mrs. Mitchell took it and looked at the lettering, and then she looked into Ted's face and saw the anger and hurt and the shattered trust. Ted narrowed his eyes. "And they're gone," he said. "Gone. Thanks to you." She reached out quickly and took both his hands in hers, and when he tried to pull away, she held on. "Ted, listen to me. I'm so sorry, but you have to hear this. I started feeling like I had to do something last night, even though I promised you I wouldn't tell anyone. But I wanted to talk to you first. So I didn't do anything. I didn't tell anyone, not even my husband." Ted shook his head as if he hadn't heard right. "What?" She said it again. "I didn't do anything, and I didn't tell anyone. No one." Ted, looking into her face, Ted knew Mrs. Mitchell wasn't lying. He just knew. And the mistake he had made about her cut him to the heart. Not to mention his rotten detective work. Good detectives are suspicious of circumstantial evidence. He stammered, I thought you..." She shook her head. And before Ted could finish his apology, another question took complete control of his thinking, and he said, "Then what happened? Why did the police show up and take them away?" Mrs. Mitchell said, "I don't know. But I can find out. I'll call Deputy Linwood at lunchtime, and I'll tell you everything I learn, all right?" Ted wanted to run out the front door of the school and ride his bike all over town and make somebody give him the facts right now. But he knew he couldn't, so he nodded. And Mrs. Mitchell said, "Then let's go back to class." Ted opened the door. In one corner, Kevin was arguing with Hannah, Lizzie, and Keith, shouting about the best way to find the lowest common denominator. And in the other corner, the 8th graders were passing Carla's iPod from hand to hand, trying to make one pair of earphones work for 4 pairs of ears. Mrs. Mitchell had the corners of the room, one quiet and focused on schoolwork in less than 15 seconds. But at the 6th grade island out in the middle, Ted Hammond was focused on something else. He was thinking like a detective again, a detective who had work to do, because this case wasn't closed. Ted felt responsible for April and her mom and brother too. He wouldn't feel settled about it until Mrs. Mitchell learned exactly what had happened to them.